It's a killing field. Today we talk about the headline that went viral last week, grabbing the world's attention and putting Israel on the defensive. But the real story is more complicated. A dangerous aid mission, constant threats from Hamas and other terror groups, and a U.S. Israeli effort to get food to Gazan civilians without handing it to terrorists. Let's break down this piece and what the follow-up has been. I'm Elena Maisel-Diamant, and this is Basic Law. The challenge of securing aid distribution from reaching Hamas has haunted the Gaza war and even well precedes it. The latest effort includes the creation of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an independent U.S. and Israeli effort, which has been operating in Gaza since May 26th. The initiative has set up distribution centers in IDF-controlled zones in central and southern Gaza and has so far provided tens of millions of meals to civilians. But GHF has also faced criticism, as there have been reports, some seemingly substantiated, of Gazans wounded and killed near its sites. The IDF is investigating incidents at which it believes lines may have been crossed. And at the same time, GHF employees themselves have been murdered and tortured by Hamas and perhaps other groups. So today we're going to try and make sense of the facts, understand what the situation may be like on the ground, and the ways in which this coverage takes a complex story and distorts it to put a target on the IDF. To do that, we're going to talk today with Andrew Fox. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So could you share a bit more about your background with the audience to explain why we're having this conversation today?
Yes, of course. So I did a law degree at university, but then I decided that jumping out of planes would be much more fun as a career than being a lawyer. So I joined the British Army. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan, one with the U.S. Army Special Forces. I did other tours in Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. And I was a paratrooper and held the rank of major when I left the British Army in 2021. I also did a number of academic qualifications. So I've studied for obviously my law degree, but also a master's in war studies, focusing on Middle Eastern strategy and psychology. Because my theory was that all wars are fought by people. So if you can understand the people a little bit better, then you'll understand the war itself a bit better. And now I'm an associate fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, which is a think tank in London. And my focus is the Middle East and defense.
Well, welcome again. Very, very glad to have you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Now, just one more bit before we jump in, which is you mentioned you have a focus on the Middle East, but you've also spent specifically some time in Israel and gotten to know the IDF from the inside, really. So could you talk a little bit about that? And maybe we'll circle back around to what you learned specifically later in the show, but just a bit more about your connection to these matters.
Yeah, of course. So after 7th of October happened, I made it a bit of a mission on social media to speak up against anti-Semitism, because my Jewish friends in the UK were heavily impacted by what had happened in Israel and the worldwide response to it. And that got me an invitation to Israel. And I've now been to Israel 6 times during the war. I went into Gaza twice with the IDF in Rafah and in the Netzarim Corridor with 401 Brigade and 252 Division. And I also went into tunnels in Lebanon with Yahalom. I got to see the Hezbollah tunnels as well. So I've been very fortunate to have access to most levels of the IDF throughout this war, from the tactical level right up to the Kyria. And I've even had interviews with the defense minister and Bibi himself. So I've been very privileged with the access I've had this war. And I think it has enabled me to give a reasonably fair and balanced commentary as the war's gone on.
Okay, so now, with that background, let's look at this coverage by Haaretz. Now, it bears mention, although I don't want to get too stuck on literary criticism, that Haaretz is on the Israeli political spectrum on the far left. It's somewhat anti-establishment, or very anti-establishment. And its bread and butter is not just in this war, but bringing these sort of radical critiques to the army, to the government. Very occasionally it hits on something that I think is real, as acknowledged by the consensus, and very often it's, at least within Israel, considered to be quite inflammatory and perhaps even inaccurate. Now, this particular story ran in slightly different language in Hebrew and English. And in English, the headline is basically asking foreign entities to pick the article and take it into consideration for charges of genocide, because it says that soldiers were told to deliberately fire on civilian crowds. So you fairly quickly, I think you were one of the first, if not one of the only, from outside of Israel to hit on this and say, well, what a hit job it was. But I'd like to hear more from you about the article and the ways in which, given the realities on the ground, which you might be familiar with in a way that many of us are not, the ways in which the coverage is questionable or skewed.
So that's a pretty broad question, and there's a lot to unpack, really. The first thing I would start with is the allegation of firing at civilians. Now, that has a very clear and distinct meaning, and it's certainly implying that there is an intent to kill. If you're firing at someone, you're trying to kill them. That doesn't match up to the rest of the report, because they're claiming 1 to 5 people a day are killed, and yet they're also claiming that the IDF is using mortars and sniper rifles and machine guns and basically all the heaviest weaponry that you would have at infantry squad or section or platoon level. So it doesn't make a huge amount of sense that only 1 to 5 people would die per day if the IDF was opening fire at the crowds with everything they had, which is clearly the implication of the article. It doesn't state it explicitly, but that's clearly what, by the headline and the tone of the piece, they're trying to suggest, is there's a crowd of Gazans queuing for food and the IDF are just mowing them down for fun. So that doesn't line up right from the offset. The second thing I would look at is firing in the direction of and firing at are very different things. And firing in the direction of could mean kind of almost half of the compass circle. You know, that's pretty broad. And again, it's designed to make you think that crowd is being fired upon. Now, I did actually speak to some of the people I know in 252 who were the targets of this article for the most part. And they were adamant that it was warning shots that they're talking about. Now, that is common practice in every army. I've done it myself in Afghanistan. And actually, the American unit I was with, we saw a really tragic outcome from a warning shot when one of the guys fired and it ricocheted and hit a small child. And these things happen in warfare, unfortunately. It's why war is horrible and you should never start them in the way that Hamas did. But warning shots would normally be fired off to the flank or over the heads of civilians. And the idea is to get them to stop what they're doing. So in the instance I'm talking about in Afghanistan, the warning shot was fired at a moving car that was approaching a roadblock too quickly. So this is common practice in militaries around the world. Now,
I suppose it may, I may have jumped a bit too early here. Like, we should probably explain, at least from what I've seen published, is that you have 4 distribution sites set up by the GHF. Right. I think the story primarily concentrates on those in the south, which is 3 different sites. And the IDF is not actually securing those sites close to the sites, but they have a perimeter a few hundred meters out, right? Where they're sort of tasked, and you can elucidate better, but with crowd control. And they're on the lookout, not just, to make sure that things are somewhat orderly, but because these centers are being targeted, not just the IDF, but because these centers themselves, which of course are meant to try and secure aid from Hamas and other groups, are being targeted by Hamas and other groups. So they're both to try and secure the center, the population, and themselves from terrorists that potentially are hiding in those crowds. Right? Is that, have I summed it up? Or
Yeah. That's a pretty fair summary. Is it? My understanding is the same.
Yeah. So in that situation, they're firing these warning shots to make sure that the crowds themselves are managed.
Yeah, kind of. I'm guessing it's more to make sure that people aren't advancing on the IDF positions. Look, the options to the IDF are pretty slim on the ground here. I've got a lot of public order experience through the British Army, where we do essentially riot control. I was, for context, my brigade, I was the subject matter expert, so it was my job to validate all the other company commanders when they were going through training. So I kind of know a bit about this. And the idea that you could somehow suit up into your riot kit and go and hold a baseline or hold, do a crowd control action in somewhere like Gaza that is a kinetic war zone, and only just in the last day or so we've had 2 Americans killed with grenades thrown at them. this just wouldn't work if you tried to do that sort of peacetime riot control stuff in Gaza right now. It just wouldn't. So the key point is there's not many options left open to the IDF here. Now, do I like firing warning shots as a method of crowd control? No, if that's what's happening. But do I see many other options for the IDF? Not really. I mean, it's a very, very challenging environment. And as you say, they're trying to, very importantly, sever Hamas's link between themselves and the people of Gaza by removing the food aid that's been leveraged by Hamas to control people and to keep Hamas in the fight. And so it's the right tactic to do that, but doing it in a war zone where the people haven't been evacuated to a safer area because there are none in Gaza. Incredibly challenging military environment, and frankly, particularly with a unit like 252 that is heavily reserve. It's not a regular unit. It's reservists. They won't have the level of professional expertise that you'd expect from a special forces unit or some of the sort of higher end Israeli Defense Force units. And so you're asking young men and women in an exceptionally challenging environment to carry out a task that is incredibly difficult with limited resources and an enemy that's trying to kill them. So, this is a very, very complex military operation for the IDF.
So since the story broke, there were sort of updates from the IDF in which they didn't confirm, obviously, the story the way it ran in the headline. They did suggest that there were investigations being opened into perhaps some incidents that they felt did cross lines, or that lessons had been learned, that they were improving signage and ways of directing civilians to reach the aid. I guess I don't want to seem like I'm justifying incidents that may have, as I said, crossed lines, but to what extent, given what you're saying, can one sort of expect that before you get to the issue of war crimes or genocide or intent to kill, that there are simply things that happen in a learning process during operations, right? That sort of seems to be what you're saying. And I'm just wondering what the expected range of that is for a very, very complex situation in terms of time and in terms of the kinds of...
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of three things I draw out here. First of all is that there will be bad people in the IDF who do bad things. Like that's the same with every army. The Australians had their special forces indicted for systemic war crimes. The British SAS are currently under investigation for war crimes. We know of a Royal Marine who executed a wounded Taliban. This is stuff that happens in war. Sometimes people are not very nice and do very unpleasant things. So you can't ever discount that from the IDF. And actually, I have spoken to friends of mine in Israel who find that quite a controversial statement. But unfortunately, human nature is human nature. And when you put people with weapons into war zones, these, bad things will occur. So there's the outright criminality, which is a possibility. The second one speaks to inexperience, speaks to mistakes happening, speaks to normal human error. Human beings make mistakes. There will have been airstrikes, for example, in Gaza, where the intelligence was wrong and more civilians were killed than was intended when the button was pressed to fire the missile. That, again, is the nature of war. The fog of war is a saying for a very good reason. Even the earliest military theorists talk about chaos being a function and a feature of war. So yeah, mistakes happen too. And yes, that does, when those mistakes involve weaponry, that does often involve people being killed. And both of those things I've just discussed ought to be investigated. And where there is negligence or criminality, then they should absolutely be prosecuted. But the key point is, that's what's happening. The fact-finding and assessment mechanism is a statutory body within Israel. It's reports directly to the chief of staff. They've had thousands of cases over their books over the last 20 months. The MAG, the Military Advocate General, they've been investigating and prosecuting soldiers who may well have committed war crimes. So yes, these bad things can happen, but the critical point is they happen in every war, and Israel is investigating it and doing something about it, which is what proper armies do. And then the third and final point, I think, just refers to the sheer chaos of that situation, the fact that no army in the world is really set up to run something like this. And I think if you threw that task at the British Army or the American Army, I mean, look at the pier. When the Americans tried it, that was deeply chaotic. And a number of Americans got injured, and I think 2 Israelis got killed defending it. So, it's chaotic, it's difficult, these things happen, and the important thing is that they're dealt with correctly once they have happened.
Thank you for breaking it down like that. So, I Googled, admittedly a few days ago, it may well be even more viral than now, but this article was retweeted thousands and thousands of times. It was, of course, referenced by, I'll be clear that they're not the same kind of outlet, but CNN and Al Jazeera and a number of others. I don't think it's a far cry to say that it's probably going to be in some way or another used as the basis of UN reporting or potentially other sorts of sanction decisions made by governments, including your own. So I wonder whether people understand that Haaretz is sort of this, perhaps even more far left on the spectrum than The Guardian or the New York Times in relation to the Israeli press coverage. I wonder whether they care. Like, how is it viewed abroad?
Unfortunately, it does carry credibility. It's one of the really big English-speaking outlets, and my Israeli friends call it Haaretz, which is probably terrible pronunciation, but I'm told it means the hatred. The issue I think we have is confirmation bias is a very powerful thing, and I'm leaning on my psychology background here rather than my military background. And there is a sort of cognitive fluency when people get new information that conforms to their pre-existing and held beliefs. And so this sort of thing goes around with absolutely no critical thinking whatsoever, because people are like, yeah, that must be true because I already believed it before I even read it. And so that's how the virality of these things occurs. But I think if we couple that with a pattern that we've seen repeatedly throughout this information war, and actually as a bit of self-publicity, I've got a paper through the Henry Jackson Society coming out in the next couple of weeks about the information war around Gaza and how this has unfolded. So if you want more information, that's something people can look at. But the pattern we've seen is that an allegation is made and it is given immediate credibility because it comes from an anti-Israel source, whereas everything the IDF says is automatically doubted as biased, which is a really difficult thing to get around, because Hamas is very clever. And yes, the casualty figures, the totemic death toll that is preached around the world is not from Hamas. When they push it out, they say it's from the Ministry of Health. And although we know the Ministry of Health is Hamas run, the very fact it's called Ministry of Health gives it that veneer of credibility in the West. They're doctors. Their doctors don't lie. And it's very similar with allegations like this from Haaretz. They use anonymous soldiers. They use, commentary that kind of, because it comes from an IDF soldier speaking against the IDF, must be true, but the IDF speaking in favor of the IDF must be false. And so we see this pattern time and time again with Israel's opponents giving a veneer of credibility to information that is both unverified and almost impossible to prove. And I think that's a really common thing we've seen for a very long time.
I will say to this point, actually, that Haaretz had a whole slew of other articles kind of in this vein, pushing the line that went viral. And one of them that surprised even me in my jaded ancient state here, was a headline that suggested that the Hamas-run health ministry, which they do also call it Hamas-run, had undercounted the deaths by a tremendous amount. I think they also quoted some UK academics to this effect. And so their big scoop there, in fact, was that numbers that had been, you wrote a report on this as well, right? Numbers that had been shown to be quite inflated were, in fact, well undercounting. I'm not even going to mention a number, but a tremendous count of casualties. But on that note, could you just refer, I think that the report was called Questionable Counting. Could you talk a bit more about it and just kind of the sort of research work you did and the conclusions you had?
Yeah, of course. So the Questionable Counting, released in December, again through the Henry Jackson Society website. It's a sort of qualitative assessment of what we could identify on those Hamas lists that they push out. So we didn't claim that we found every mistake. We didn't claim that we had the ability to go through it and dig into every single one of the, at the time, I think it was 42,000 dead. But what we could do was look at trends. We could look at repeated errors that we found. So bearing in mind we had only really open source reporting to go on, the very basics of it, we looked at names and found men listed as women, women listed as men, adults listed as children, people who'd been killed by Hamas that we could prove through social media were on the lists. There were cancer patients who'd left Gaza for treatment on the lists. There were just a variety of errors. Now we didn't find all of them. We didn't find thousands and thousands, but we found enough just on what was available to suggest that there was inaccuracy in the numbers. And we didn't go so far as to suggest manipulation. But what we did suggest is that just from what we found, the odds of us finding the only mistakes, I would suggest, is very, very small. And therefore, the fact that these figures had been pumped out as reliable by the world's media was an inaccuracy because they clearly weren't. And then, of course, in April this year, Hamas themselves agreed with us and removed thousands of names, which proved our point to a T. Now, some of the stuff you're referring to in Haaretz is academics who unfortunately spent 18 months plus telling us just how accurate and reliable these figures were. And unfortunately, last April, Hamas cut their legs away by agreeing with their critics. And a lot of the reports we're seeing is people now desperately trying to recover their credibility and reputation. And there's so much more to it, though, than just the mistakes on the lists. There's the repeated pattern that we've seen from operations in Gaza all the way back to the first time Israel went in to have a conflict with Hamas. And that is Hamas never reveal fighter deaths, and they blame everything as a civilian death on Israel. And we're seeing that again now. And there's social media evidence of Hamas's government officials saying, do not put on social media if your dead loved one is a fighter rather than a civilian. So that they actively tell the world that they're suppressing this, and yet the world ignores it. We also found the IDF's total estimates have been pretty reliable. They've overcounted ever so slightly in previous conflicts, but they're there or thereabouts. So when they say 20,000 plus Hamas dead on those lists, the historical evidence suggests that that's probably correct. I think the most important thing we found, though, was we were one of the first papers to debunk this idea of 70% women and children. If you look at the fighting age range, which unfortunately, because we know Hamas uses child soldiers, is about 15 to 45, 72% of people in that fighting age range were male. Okay, so that all leads us to suggest that actually this isn't a genocide. It's not the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. It is a war that's being fought against a vicious terror army that has embedded itself within the civilian population to try and maximize casualties to get headlines against Israel.
Now, in a previous conversation, I had asked you a question about whether just people didn't understand war anymore, and that was maybe one of the things leading to very sloppy coverage. And you had, I thought, a very incisive and insightful answer that I'm wondering whether you would consider sharing with us again about wars of choice.
Yeah, of course. And I think people don't realize that Israel is fighting an existential war for survival, or has been since 7th of October. It's not quite so much of an existential threat now after the last 21 months, I'm glad to say. But the fact is, as 7th of October happened, Israel was on the wrong end of a genocidal assault that would have carried on slaughtering Israelis until the very last bullet was fired. This wasn't a planned sort of tactical objective. It wasn't a sort of raid to seize terrain or anything you would expect from a sort of normal military operation. It was just a genocidal slaughtering rampage. And there's no other country in the world that would have shown restraint in the face of that happening on their borders. If Mexico had gone into California and started slaughtering San Franciscans, we can only imagine what the American response would have been on Mexico City. This is not a war of choice for Israel, whereas the wars that we in the West have fought over the last 20 years are almost exclusively wars of choice. If you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, those wars didn't need to happen after 9/11. Afghanistan, you can see a case for going in and taking out Al-Qaeda training camps or trying to overthrow the Taliban. But we spent 20 years there and replaced the Taliban with the Taliban. So that wasn't a mission that was particularly effective. And I can obviously speak from firsthand experience of that particular disaster of a military operation. Iraq didn't need to happen at all. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no threat to the UK or the USA, and yet we threw in multiple armored divisions into places like Basra and Fallujah. And again, entirely optional. They hadn't attacked us, that they were unlikely ever to attack us. And this was not existential for either America or the UK. It was an option to do this, whereas Israel doesn't have the option. And I think that's what people fail to understand.
Now I get to ask a question that we never fully explored about. We started and then we got cut off last time we talked about your visit here in Israel. And I preface this again by saying this is not a softball question meant to elicit only the rosy aspects of your trip here, but I was wondering what it was like to come in as an outsider and probably with maybe even a certain view of the IDF from British press coverage, and what you learned when you were here, for good and for bad.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I'd been following the war more closely than most because it was my job. So I had a pretty good idea of what was going on, and I was familiar with the basic muscle moves of maneuver on the ground in Gaza and which division had been where and that kind of thing. I was obviously aware of the criticism. The positives that surprised me were how good the military thinkers were in the Curia. Actually, the operational planning I thought was top tier, especially as Southern Command and as well. Some of the operations they planned in North Gaza, when they explained the military logic behind it, was very, very impressive. Likewise, at the tactical level, I think the high-end IDF units are outstanding. Units like Yahalom were very, very impressive. And also, when you go down to things like the reserve units and those non-professional full-time soldiers, perhaps they're not as impressive on a soldiering level, because how could they be? They were never. These are bankers and IT professionals and taxi drivers and tour guides. It's it's a very difficult ask. You've got to put a full reserve unit into the field. But what did impress me about them was the character and the sentiment that the soldiers expressed. I never spoke to anyone in there who hated Gazan civilians. There was nobody who wanted to be there and murder people. They expressed regret that the war had to happen, but understood the risks to their country if they didn't do it. And so they had that sense of duty, and I found that quite compelling. On the flip side, I think there are certainly areas of fire control which I think have been perhaps a little bit looser than I would have preferred to see. I've spoken to IDF soldiers who have told me about war crimes that have happened and people have been shot who shouldn't have been. So, there are disciplinary issues, I think, at certain levels in the IDF. And one takeaway was actually the base I visited in Gaza really, really needed a sergeant major just to get a grip of it. It was a bit less disciplined than perhaps I would have expected to see from maybe a British unit. But overall, it's a very impressive army with some very impressive kits, some very, very impressive officers and soldiers. And also they have the knack of winning their wars, whereas as a British soldier, we lost all of ours while I was in uniform. So, I'm not going to try and take some sort of moral high ground on that front. But yeah, just as professional observations, some good, some bad, just as you get with every army in the world. And what I refuse to do is apply a different standard to the IDF that I would apply to any other army. And I think that's part of the problem in the narrative that we've seen around this war, is that the IDF are expected to be perfect all the time. And when anything goes wrong, they get torn apart from it, when no other army in the world would face that level of scrutiny or expectation.
And because the term war crime has come up, I just want to be clear that you're saying there have been, as in all armies, a soldier here, a soldier there, who has willfully strayed from what he should be doing. But that it's not, this is where my Israeli-ness has to come through. We're not talking about the IDF. We're talking about individuals that may have gone off and done whatever incidents we're talking about.
Yeah, we should be very, very clear about that.
Yeah.
This is everything I found is the opposite of systemic. Actually the IDF works really, really hard to put the correct rules of engagement and procedures and practices in place. And I've seen them firsthand. I've looked at the targeting processes of the Israeli Air Force. I've looked at the rules of engagement of your average IDF combat units. I've seen the control measures, as we call them, that the IDF puts on the ground in Gaza to try and stop harm to civilians and to other IDF troops that might be alongside them. The IDF is doing everything that any other army would do, and probably a little bit more than that as well, to try and make sure that this war happens in a legal and practical manner. But it doesn't change the fact that Hamas have weaponized the entirety of Gaza. The damage is horrendous. And I've seen it with my own eyes, and it was shocking even to me as an experienced soldier just how damaged everything is. But then you see in the buildings, and you see the tunnel shafts, and you see the IEDs that are in almost every other house in places like Rafah. You see the tunnels that run under hospitals and mosques and schools and children's bedrooms. And then you can understand with that context why the damage has happened, because there's two options here. You either engage the enemy where they are, and if they've chosen to be in hospitals or schools or mosques, then that's where they get engaged, or you don't fight at all. These are the two options here. There's no middle road for Israel. When you've got the enemy commanders hiding in tunnels, you can't just do precision strikes like you did in Iran or Beirut, because Hamas has come up with a tactic specifically designed to stop you being able to do that. And so we're just left with two options. Either you go in properly and actually attack the enemy wherever they are, or you don't fight. And that's the only options the IDF had on the table.
Well, I'm glad to know we're doing our best. As far as the aid efforts within Gaza, from what I understand, the UN is starting to resume certain shipments on its own. Israel is working with GHF, obviously, which is supposed to be a U.S. Israeli independent initiative. And there's also a militia within Gaza that is sort of coordinated with the IDF. It's been called Israeli-backed. That's supposed to be securing some of the aid shipments from Hamas. So it's a situation that requires innovative thinking and a lot of courage and commitment to see it through. And let's hope that it succeeds. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that we'll have future conversations.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope people found that useful.